Another day and another whoopsie from Jordan Peterson on antinatalism. So recently Jordan was on Bill Maher's podcast or sit-down show, sort of fireside chat type thing. Briefly, the topic of antinatalism comes up. Now, I wanted to give some thoughts on this. Some of it is new territory, some of it is just the same old tropes that him and the likes of people like Elon Musk peddle. But I thought it was worth responding to, if only briefly. So let's get into it.
If you are tortured, even unjustly, and you lose faith in yourself and the structure of existence, it isn't only that you become demoralized, it's that you tilt towards malevolence. You start to work against things.
So the first thing I want to say here, before we actually get into antinatalism or anything, is that what Peterson is saying here as fact may not actually be true. I don't know the research on this, and I didn't feel like it was a significant enough point to go into that for the purposes of this video. But Peterson essentially says, like, if you've been harmed unjustly in some way, then you're going to tilt towards malevolence and start harming others. Right? You're going to be bitter about it. Now, obviously, all of us have probably seen examples of this in our lives. So it's understandable to say that at least some people in these circumstances will be bitter and, as the saying goes, hurt people hurt people. So that's understandable. But to say that that is just what happens is also not true. There are many instances of people who have been unjustly harmed by individuals or state actors or non-state actors, terrorists, whoever, and through that experience have gone on to found institutions or write books or engage in general practices that benefit others. And they come to doing that through their experience of unjust suffering. One example could be someone who is locked up for minor drug charges. Now, they could come out of their prison sentence being very bitter, or they could come out of that and start campaigning for drug reform. Another instance is you could have someone who is raped. Now, they may, separate from the trauma, come out of that very bitter and see the world in a very dark way, or they could come out of it and want to campaign in such a way where there are further protections for those who are particularly vulnerable to rape, for example. These are just two examples. There will be many other examples of people who are persecuted for political beliefs, religious beliefs, etc., etc. So that's one thing I just wanted to cover there. Peterson is using this sort of assumption that just because someone feels like they are sort of unjustly suffering, and he's going to be aiming that at antinatalists, he's making the assumption there that they're just going to come out of it malevolent, which is not the case. So the very premise that he's basing everything he's going to say on here is faulty.
This is why, for example, I'm not thrilled in the least with the antinatalist types. You know, they make this claim that existence is characterized by suffering that's so intense that it would be better if consciousness itself just ceased to exist.
So now let's get into antinatalism. So straight off the bat, Peterson is completely wrong. Antinatalism is not about consciousness ceasing to exist. Antinatalism is just the opposition to procreation, generally because it's seen that coming into existence is harm. Now, okay, someone could say that maybe in the abstract, if this is a universal thing, then if no new beings are brought into existence, as antinatalism would like, then all of the current individuals in existence will eventually die, and therefore, you know, there will be no more consciousness in the world, so consciousness would cease to exist. Now, first of all, he didn't disambiguate that from the case of like antinatalists wanting to like kill people or end existing lives, which is not what it's about. And given his massive platform and the fact he's supposed to be a big-brained guy, you would think he'd disambiguate those two very different things that have very different ramifications. But also the fact that later in this conversation, he sort of extrapolates through some biblical story that, you know, people who are malevolent may become genocidal.
And so then maybe you get cynical and you get bitter. But the problem is that that has a direction too. That is what happens to Cain. Like, he starts out cynical and bitter, but he ends up murderous, and his descendants are genocidal.
Which fits into the rhetoric like man-children like Elon Musk make on platforms like X. It doesn't seem like too much of a stretch that actually Jordan was implying the case of ending existing lives, which is completely different from what antinatalism actually is. And I don't think he was talking about the more charitable interpretation of once existing lives go out of existence, consciousness ceases to exist. So great, he's slagging off and demonizing a group of people, and has historically done that he doesn't even understand what they believe.
That's Mephistopheles' case, by the way.
It's Silenus in Greek mythology.
Well, you can make a case for it.
What would be better to have never been born?
Exactly.
Very quickly on this, because Silenus was mentioned, if anyone's interested in this sort of idea of it would have been better never to have been born arising in ancient Greece, I'm going to link an article below. That's not the main topic of this video, but I just wanted to make people aware of it. So that's linked below.
Yeah. Now, and you might say, okay, you know, fair enough. What you're doing essentially is saying that the suffering in existence invalidates its utility.
Okay, so this is an interesting one. This idea of like suffering in existence being so bad that it invalidates its utility. Again, classic Jordan Peterson. He isn't disambiguating between two different things that he could be meaning here. And honestly, I don't even think he's thought about this deeply enough to understand that there are two things to disambiguate between. So the reason this is ambiguous is because he's referring to the utility of suffering being invalidated. The utility to who? So there could be the case of someone who already exists, and then there's the case of someone who you're considering bringing into existence. So let's start with the case of someone who already exists, right? And this is already outside the realm of antinatalism. So in that case, you might have someone who, let's say, for example, is in a situation where they're generally near the end of their life anyway. Let's say they're very old and maybe they've contracted some sort of disease or developed some sort of chronic disease, and they're in a great amount of pain, and the utility, which there's probably very little of, the utility in this pain, is completely outweighed by the intrinsically negative nature of the pain. Now, in that case, the negativity of the pain itself is going to invalidate, in Jordan Peterson's words, the utility of the pain, which I'm sure would be very little in this case. And in response to this, someone then may make the judgment that it's better for their life to end. So that's one case. The other case is considering a person who you may be bringing into existence. And this is in the realm of antinatalism. This is what antinatalists talk about. Now, the utility that suffering can have once you're in existence. Now, the utility that suffering can have to someone who's in existence is of no value to someone who you're considering bringing into existence. They don't stand to benefit from the instrumental value that can be found in certain forms of suffering. So let me give you an example. An existing person who goes to the gym, they will elect to go through some level of suffering because it has an instrumental value in building character, but also their long-term goals of building strength, etc. That makes sense for that individual who already exists. But if you're considering bringing someone into existence, the instrumental value that can be found in a suffering like going to the gym is of no value to them because they don't exist to have those long-term goals or to need to build character. And Jordan, as big-brained as he supposedly is, really should disambiguate between these two things because one, there is a genuine weighing up of the utility that can come from suffering and the negative value of suffering itself, and making an assessment as to whether that means that you should continue your existence or not. In the other instance, when you're thinking about bringing someone into existence, the negative value of that suffering that will be imposed on them if you bring them into existence is very real. It is a massive stick in this equation, but the instrumental value that can come from suffering once you exist is not a carrot to tempt us to create someone.
But what if it is the case that if you believe that you become an agent that produces suffering? Well, that is what seems to happen.
Now, another thing I want to touch on is this idea of like antinatalists becoming malevolent and harming others. Obviously, this hasn't been studied. It actually would be extremely hard to study how much a certain group of people harms others just generally in their life, because harm is often this elusive concept we point to, which is hard to put some sort of unit on. What would a unit of harm even be? But anyway, putting that aside and the fact that it hasn't been studied, I'm not sure where Jordan is getting this idea that antinatalists are causing a lot of harm to people, especially through them being malevolent. Now, this is completely anecdotal. Again, like I said, this is not researched at all. But in my experience of understanding antinatalists, and I presume I understand them better than Jordan because I've met many, many more antinatalists than Jordan, and I've had many more meaningful interactions with them, as evidenced by his lack of understanding of antinatalism. But I'm skeptical of this idea that antinatalists are particularly causing harm to people, especially through being malevolent. Many antinatalists are very considered in thinking about the impacts they have on others, in my experience. Many antinatalists are vegan, so that's going to massively reduce the negative impact they have on animals. Obviously, antinatalists aren't biologically reproducing, so they're not imposing harm in that way either. But obviously, like any group of people, antinatalists are not saints. There are nut jobs in the antinatalist community, and if someone wanted to commit the cherry-picking fallacy, they could point to those people. But in general, my experience of the antinatalist community, and of course there's going to be a biased sample because I'm only considering the people I have interacted with in some way, I would say there's maybe a stronger case to say that antinatalists probably cause less harm than non-antinatalists, but we really don't know because it's not been studied, so we can't make strong judgments either way. Anyway, that was basically basically everything I wanted to say in response to this clip. One final thing I want to add is something that they actually said earlier in the conversation, which wasn't in relation to antinatalism, but I just wanted to include it because it's a telling admission of how they understand reality and the fact that if, and I don't know Bill Maher's opinions on this, but if Jordan Peterson does endorse bringing people into existence, this is the sort of existence he's endorsing bringing people into. So let's see what they think of the world we live in.
Well, life is random. Good people get punished for no reason, and bad people go unpunished.
Well, and lots of times good people suffer terribly.
Anyway, let me know what you thought of my thoughts. Let me know what you thought of Bill Maher and Jordan Peterson's thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one.